Assalamu alaikum, friends. Thank you very much for joining us through the Zoom link, and you all are welcome in the second episode of our discussion series on our current political situation, which is prevailing all over the world. Our two distinguished guests, the topic of today is Palestine suffering, and our two distinguished guests are number one is Dr. Raja Swamy. He is very well known for his voice, which is always there for all the oppression, right? Wherever there is oppression, he always come up and he resist. And the second, our honorable guest is Dr. Ali Raza. Dr. Ali Raza is also known by us for a long time. In a very recent past, he just delivered one lecture. He was traveling from Germany or somewhere, but he came to Karachi in a transit and he delivered the lecture for us. Thank you very much, both of you. Friends, as a formality, I just take 1 or 2 minutes more. As a formality, I just want to introduce Irtiqa Institute of Social Sciences as a General Secretary of Irtiqa Institute. Irtiqa Institute is a platform through which we always try to promote critical thinking. For that reason, we organize seminars, we conduct webinars, we also publish the papers whenever we get a chance, right? So we are here, our main headquarters is in Karachi, Pakistan. So once again, you all are welcome for this episode, and I hope that you must have get something out of it. So in last, I just want Ms. Dr. Ali Raza to please proceed with the program.
Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And once Dr. Rajaswamy has delivered his presentation, then we can have a conversation. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raza, and thank you so much, Kamran Saab, and all of the comrades and friends at the Irtiqa Institute. It is a privilege and an honor to be a part of this conversation and to also speak and share my own learnings about something of such an important matter, of such a big and important matter as the suffering that is going on in Palestine. The other thing I just wanted to kind of lay out was that when I saw the poster, I was really thrilled and moved by the focus on Palestinian suffering, and as I was thinking about like how to go about opening up this conversation, I learned from Arsalan Khan, who's my colleague here, as well as from Kalim Saab, with whom I had a very good conversation last week, that people are more or less in the Irtiqa Institute and the Irtiqa Institute community are more or less well informed about a lot of the stuff that is happening in Gaza right now, in Palestine right now. And Dr. Raza also, reaffirmed that observation and said, people generally know about this stuff. So simply talking about like what is happening might not be the most productive use of this time. So I suggested, how about we kind of, maybe focus on, when we think about Palestinian suffering, there is literally like a whole century of knowledge that we can kind of dive into and think about all the horrible things that have been done to the Palestinian people. But one thing that I think we should perhaps remind ourselves always, and do honor and to the Palestinian people, is to focus on their struggles, to focus on their long history of glorious resistance to all of these various forces that have been against them and hurting the people, both body and soul, but also historically, geographically, what has happened in terms of the occupation and the kind of the attack on the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, to sovereignty, to life. So I want to focus on this theme of resistance. And I thought, what better way to focus on this theme of resistance than to dive into the fascinating history of the 1936 to 1939 Great Palestinian Revolt. And this was a chapter in history that has been, for various reasons, kind of obscured. Those of us from the subcontinent are aware of the 1940s, especially 1947, 48. Very, very, kind of tectonic shifts were taking place, and we're all aware of the legacy of struggle as well as the great tragedies that befell the subcontinent during that period of time. The promises and the failures of everything that happened after, etc. But other than recognizing that 1948 was this moment in the history of Palestine we refer to as the Nakba, al-Nakba, and the kind of emergence of the sort of under these catastrophic circumstances, the emergence of a settler colonial entity, we don't quite pay too much attention to what happened just a few years before that, right? How this fantastic and amazing chapter in history was written, through the blood, sweat, and tears of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and youth in Palestine during this period. So, given the current context, especially with the revolt that has now begun, the Al-Aqsa Flood rebellion that began in 2023 in Gaza, and it's sort of continuation in various ways. This chapter of resistance, struggle, and the violent suppression of this struggle, I think, would be a useful lens through which we can maybe put in perspective what is happening now in Palestine. So I'll share a few slides, and I thought it'd be useful to kind of have some slides. So please bear with me if it is, if it covers content that you're already familiar with, or if it gets too much bogged down in details. I'll definitely try not to bore you, and I'll try to kind of develop just some points here, just so we can get a sense of how the 1936 revolt that began in 36 and kind of went on for the next 3 years, just until the moment where the Second World War broke out. In order to kind of perhaps offer some thoughts for a good conversation after. So, if you look at like this period of time in the mid 1930s, this is I just found this map. I thought it was very useful to give us a sense of the immense kind of colonial logic that was shaping the entire geography of this region, and I include here also the British colonial India, the sort of, the terms that are used, protectorate, dominion, crown colony, condominium, etc., are references to varying degrees of control exerted by British power in this entire region, which is, literally spanning 3 continents, right? Parts of Europe, good chunks of Asia, and good chunks of Africa. So, in this moment, the sort of events of 1936 can perhaps be placed in a kind of historical and geographical context. Why did this revolt happen, and how did this revolt take place? And why is it important? Of course, we know that this revolt and its history and legacy have been in many ways willfully suppressed from the historical narrative. We don't really learn much about it. We think about 1930s and 40s, as a period of, time around the Second World War. So we also hear about, decolonization, especially in the 1940s. And we hear about like the emergence of new nation states and so on. But we don't quite really know much about, or we don't learn much about the Great Revolt in Palestine. It was, by all accounts of historians, one of the most significant anti-colonial revolts of the 20th century. It was very significant, not in the least, not really because it succeeded, because it didn't succeed, but because of the kind of the character of this revolt, the scale of it, and the kind of the depth to which the Palestinian national narrative grounded itself in this sort of legacy of struggle against multiple forces. In this case, particularly 2 important forces. One was British colonial power under the Mandate, and 2, the Zionist project, which was hell-bent on colonizing, displacing, and eventually replacing the Palestinian people with European Jews who were flowing into Palestine during this period of time, encouraged massively by the British colonial administration. So the sort of double enemy that the Palestinian people faced. was met with this very very powerful struggle. So the scale and intensity are definitely very important here to keep in mind. In addition, let's also remember that Palestine during this period of time was of very, very strategic importance to British global power. It was not merely a place for the British to simply send Jewish people from Europe. And remembering, of course, that Europe was deeply, deeply committed to anti-Semitism, right? This wasn't just in Germany. Europeans were by and large very, very embracive of the idea that Jews are quote unquote problematic to Europe. And so finding a way to kind of get Jewish people out of Europe was also a kind of major driving factor. But importantly, this geopolitical meaning of Palestine during that time involved its strategic location, in the intersection of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Also, very importantly for Europe, you also had this sort of a moment where the power of these sort of great imperial entities of Britain and France, their colonial power was beginning to kind of decline during the early 20th century, and during this time you saw the emergence of other kinds of contestants. The United States, of course, in the early 20th century became sort of the new imperial entity that was sort of emerging with its colonization of the Philippines, etc. But you also saw the rise of fascist Germany in the 1930s and its ally, fascist Italy. But of course, clearly, in the backdrop also was, following the Russian Revolution, you had the sort of this great project of socialism emerging with the Soviet Union. So Britain and France were kind of seeing their star kind of gradually be eclipsed by all of these other competitors. Now, in the wake of these multiple threats that Britain is kind of encountering, you also have the kind of this long period of anti-Semitism in Europe, right? And so Palestine becomes important for all of these reasons. Plus, you also see the sort of weirdly contradictory position that European Jews occupy. On the one hand, Britain, France, Germany, etc., steeped in anti-Semitism, don't don't want to kind of accept Jewish people as being equals. And this is, of course, very openly advocated in the fascist, projects in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, but in other parts of Europe as well. This idea that Jewish people are sort of, problematic members of European society. You need to be kind of, there needs to be a way to move them out or kind of, acculturate them, etc., etc. All this is going on in the early 20th century. But this contradictory position also kind of comes out in terms of how European Jews now become key agents in the colonization of what is decidedly a non-European place, right? Palestine. And so, as a kind of as somewhat of a European people, they are now working alongside with British colonial power in order to enact this process of making this new entity called, which is the Zionist state, which eventually becomes the state of Israel. The strategic interests of this particular geolocation also important to keep in mind, because now you have oil playing a huge role. Right? Oil has been discovered in the early decades of the 20th century, and now Saudi Arabia and Iraq now become major producers of oil, of course. And Britain, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, has sort of extended its control over these regions. And with oil exploration, Haifa in Palestine becomes developed very quickly in the 1920s as an important transit point, a port where that can now transship oil from extracted from Iraq and Saudi Arabia into European markets. In addition, Britain's kind of so-called jewel in the crown, British colonial India, also is sort of an important thing for Britain to consider. So this is a geostrategic location which links India to Europe in that broader scheme of things. So oil, as well as older colonial and more established colonial kinds of relationships. So all of these factor into Britain's key interests in this particular region. But in 1936, this revolt explodes. This revolt explodes in a very, very dramatic and spectacular way. And there are multiple phases to it. I just wanted to kind of share a couple of images here that I think would be very useful to keep in mind. You can see these are, multiple men, some on horseback with weapons. These are the the Palestinian fighters in the late 1930s who were actively involved in the armed insurgency, and this was a very central part of the revolt. But as I will show, it was not the only part. There were other aspects of the revolt as well. What I find particularly fascinating about this image is the flag. If you look at the imagery on the flag, you see the combination of the crescent, the Islamic crescent, the symbol, and the cross, signifying a kind of unified Muslim Christian dimension to this particular struggle, right? Contrary to the kind of Orientalist approach of thinking about the Arab world as being steeped in this sort of very parochial politics of ethno-chauvinism, religious chauvinism, etc. The Palestinian struggle was testament to a very different kind of politics and a different set of goals and ambitions articulated by the Palestinian people along these lines. Um, Another aspect of this struggle that is very important to keep in mind, as I mentioned, the armed struggle was one aspect of it. And clearly you see people here with weapons, right, participating in this struggle. In this grainy image, you also see, notably, you see two men here, you see a man standing back, and then you see two women. And on the right, the image on the right, you see a group of women and girls who are marching, holding a banner, also as part of the struggle. Right. So this was a kind of broad-based struggle that drew in many sections of society into its ambit. Right. So that said, let's kind of take a look at multiple aspects of this. I won't go through all of these in detail, but just sort of give you some sense. First and foremost, there was the early phase of the 1936 phase. In spring of 1936, you saw the emergence of the kind of the explosive entry of the general strike. This drew in many different sections of society. In fact, the general strike was notable because it brought largely urban members of society who often in various colonial contexts, the urban sections of society tend to be much more kind of integrated into sort of the urban logic of colonial rule. But here you saw a massive amount of grassroots infrastructure developed. You had various kinds of organizing, ground up, right, or grassroots based. And this is Charles Anderson, a historian, refers to this and describes this as a kind of form of state formation from below. And why this is important? Because the Palestinian struggle was not simply about overthrowing British power or overthrowing the Zionist project. It was about building a new state reality, building a new reality grounded on in the logic of a state. So sovereignty is guaranteed through the formation of a new state. And towards this, what Anderson argues, as does Ted Swedenborg and others, that one has to look at the 1936 revolt as a moment in which Palestinian aspirations towards not just liberation from the colonial power, but also to produce and create in its place a new emergent possibility, a state, a Palestinian entity. So you had these various committees that are formed on the grassroots. Men, women, and youth are involved in this. You have committees for strike supervision, medical relief, financial support, for legal services, the supervising boycott, practices. So there was a call for a boycott of Jewish and British goods, boycott of providing labor for various Zionist entities and also British colonial entities, but also committees that were beginning to see themselves as sort of juridical in nature, right? So they were doing things like conflict resolution, arbitrating in local kinds of conflicts. This saw the ample involvement of student organizations in the urban areas, women's organizations as well. What the general strike did was opened up this huge space for popular participation. Now, let's keep in mind, at the apex of this were the so-called national committees, right? These were the sort of the guiding force behind the general strike. They kind of provided the basis for thinking about how the strike is going to unify all the various parts of Palestinian society across religious distinctions, across class distinctions. So sort of multi-class aspect to this particular struggle. Also, interestingly enough, while the national committees were largely urban-based, they had also deep-rooted connections with the armed insurgency, which was much more based in the rural area. So they involved themselves in arms procurement and providing wages for fighters. There was something like, I think, 10 Palestinian pounds per month for each fighter. They provided family support. So, of the fighters, since the fighters are now out in hiding and they're kind of mobilizing attacks, etc., their families need some source of, money, etc. So the committees were doing this stuff. And so the strike went on for a period of time in 1936, and then eventually the kind of leadership that was much more urban based and much more drawn from the more elite sections of Palestinian society negotiated somewhat of a kind of a truce with the British colonial authority and said, okay, fine, we'll lay low. And so the strike kind of semi-ended. Right? But the driving contradictions were still on. Land was still being grabbed from Palestinian communities. The labor struggles on the ground were still kind of exploding. Palestinian workers were being driven out of Jewish factories and Jewish workplaces. More and more people were being brought into, in the 1930s, especially, a huge influx of Jewish people from Europe, largely from Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, that are now horrified by the emergence of the Nazi Party in power in 1933. So you see this influx of more and more European Jews, and the British colonial authorities sort of encouraging this influx during this time. And this influx is led by the Zionist project, which is not about having Jewish people find a home in Palestine among Palestinian Arabs, right? But it's about replacing this land and kind of driving Palestinian Arabs out and kind of creating a Jewish homeland that is an ethno-chauvinistic and a racialist kind of project. And so these contradictions are still at play. So the Palestinian movement now, returns to the struggle now, but here you see the explosive entry of an armed insurgency. So between 37 and 39, you see this huge kind of military dimension to the struggle. And interestingly enough, this military dimension was not centralized. It wasn't led by some kind of central body, which made it actually much more effective. It was a very modularly organized military operation, and it organically linked both urban and rural populations. And here this was very important because the kinds of ways in which people were affected span both rural agricultural populations as well as the urban working class populations. In fact, much of the migration to the cities had to do with the distress that Palestinian small farmers and peasants were facing with both Zionist colonization as well as taxation. So British Mandate Authority was heavily taxing this rural population as well. And much of this taxation was driving these people to, abandon the rural farms, lose their lands, etc. And also alongside that, some kind of more affluent Palestinians were, finding ways to kind of make peace with the Zionist colonial project by either selling off land or by kind of transferring their lands over to Zionist operators and so on and so forth. So you were seeing a much more kind of, organic connection between rural and urban. Because the rural countryside is facing this distress, people are moving to the cities seeking work. But in the cities, they're facing other kinds of hazards, because the Jewish dominated workplaces are now actively discriminating against Palestinian workers. Palestinian workers are receiving anything from 10% of the wages that are offered to Jewish workers to even far less in some particular sectors. So the 1930s is a period of great amounts of disaffection, right? Now, so the other aspect to the insurgency is that aside from the armed insurgency, the insurgency also involves the establishment of new kinds of institutions. And so the Great Revolt during this time, between 37-39, establishes itself and builds popular legitimacy among the people by engaging in things like kind of taxation that target the rich. So even Palestinian business owners, landowners are now, asked to contribute funds, and this is in terms of, either in cash or kind. They have to contribute towards the revolt, and so these governing apparatuses also emerge. They have a kind of taxation regime that is also keeping in mind that the vast numbers of people who are struggling, the working class Palestinian people, are are suffering not only from British colonial taxation, not only from Zionist colonization, but also at the hands of many of the kind of elite members of Palestinian society. So there's that aspect. There's also the development of a kind of a military style intelligence network, because this is a period of time that British authorities are kind of really clamping down on Palestinian society and want to crush this rebellion. So they develop rebel justice system, courts, but also these intelligence networks that help ensure that villages stay within the ambit of the revolt. So a lot of these institutional developments taken together suggest that perhaps we need to think about the revolt not simply as a fight against colonial rule and against Zionist colonization, but also for the development of a nascent Palestinian state. Right? Today, we keep constantly, in the last 20, 30 years since the Oslo Accords, is always, reiteration of Palestinian state, Palestinians, as if it's some kind of gift given by the West to the Palestinian people. We forget this glorious struggle in, going back 70, 80, 90 years, that the Palestinians have been actually struggling to build and create their own sovereign state, and this period of time gives us a very, very interesting insight into some of the makeup of this particular project. So. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but the broad kind of argument that's being developed here is that if you just look at the kind of image here, and this is going back to the pre-colonial era, right? So the Palestinian producers had this sort of very ambivalent relationship to the local landed elite, right? In this case, the sheikhs, who were, along with tax collectors appointed by the Ottoman state, part and parcel through the late 19th century of the sort of taxation regime. With the commercialization of agriculture in the 19th century, largely under the rule of the Ottomans, the ability of Palestinian agricultural producers to be able to pay taxes was also strained. So they were already struggling even before the mandate period. So I just want to keep in mind there's a kind of class dynamic that straddles the Ottoman period, the late Ottoman period, and works its way into the early 20th century. So. And in this context, the relationship between the sheikhs, the local landed elite, and the Palestinian small peasant was one that was governed both by a class logic, but also a kind of logic of patronage. And we see this patronage structures also in the subcontinent very much so, between landlords and peasants, where there's sort of an expectation, a moral obligation almost of the landlord to kind of also address the needs of the peasantry, even as the peasantry is being super exploited by the landlord. So this logic is also important to keep in mind, because during the revolt, you see this sort of played out where the more elite sections of the Palestinian society found themselves having to actually move towards the revolt and actually align themselves with the revolt, where the energy for that revolt, the militancy of that revolt, was coming from the working class, from the peasantry, and from the youth, the kind of radicalized youth in the urban areas, who are pushing for a more militant kind of outcome. So the kind of the landed elite as well as the business elite in the cities in Palestine were finding themselves in this sort of moment where they had to, they were obligated to kind of work with the revolutionaries during this period of time. Let's just sort of very quickly go over, since we don't have too much time. I don't want to spend too much of this time here. I just want to kind of lay out here the key beneficiaries of the British colonial authority during this time, the mandate, were, of course, the colonial authority itself, which with its sort of very, very intense kind of logic of taxation, taking various resources, laying claim to land and resources and labor. But of course, they're kind of key proxies in this process. And writers like Ghassan Kanafani and others have pointed out that, whereas in the Ottoman period, you had these sheikhs who kind of occupied, or these ayan, the sort of feudal clerical patriarchs, as you call them, who occupied a sort of middle role where they would kind of work with the Ottoman state in order to facilitate taxation. And keep the peasant producers in line. Under British rule, the British began to see the Zionist migrants as the kind of key enforcers of the logic of colonial rule. So the Zionist project and Zionist settler colonialists became not only beneficiaries under British protection, but also became kind of instruments of the British colonial agenda as well. And this was played out during the 1936 to 39 revolt, because many of the kind of militias that grew later into these sort of Zionist militias that dispossessed the Palestinian people in the 1948 Nakba were actually put together in the 1930s with the help of the British. They were armed and trained by the British. So you had these auxiliary troops that were also working with the British in order to dispossess Palestinians and to suppress the revolt as well. You had certain urban commercial and financial interests that were also Zionist European Jews who not only enjoyed various advantages, they had all kinds of the British authorities had tariffs on imports to facilitate Zionist businesses, to ensure that to protect Zionist businesses from competition, while their kind of ability to earn larger incomes, etc., has to be contrasted with the very low incomes that were being provided, or poverty wages that were being provided to Palestinian labor in the cities. Then you also had the kinds of notables, these Ayan, the feudal clerical patriarchs, who occupied a kind of ambivalent role, but nevertheless tended to side with the colonial authority, because their whole, for example, the kind of big landowners, they gained from the export trade, right? So they were gaining from the export of mainly citrus crops, right, oranges, etc. That were seen as very luxury consumption items in Europe. So many of these sort of business nobles were also benefiting from this process. But as I mentioned, they occupied a kind of ambivalent role, because the revolutionaries pushed them towards kind of supporting the struggle against colonial rule and against Zionism. So who are the key opponents? If I will just take 1 or 2 more minutes, sorry for going so much. So long. The key opponents, of course, the British policies were primarily the so-called fellahin, the peasantry. These were folks who had been alienated or dispossessed over many decades, right? Over time, the kind of rural distress, if you will, agricultural distress, with its roots in the Ottoman period through the commercialization of agriculture, etc., but which became intensified now also because of Zionist colonization and the gradual alienation of land. They were dispossessed, and they were kind of at the point of very desperate conditions. You had various labor organizers who were now grown very strong. In 1925, the Arab Workers' Society was developed and was actually grew in the urban areas. That was focused primarily on the plight and conditions of the Palestinian workers in the sort of industrial as well as construction, etc., etc. There's a really interesting quote I'm citing from Ghassan Kanafani's book here. The Arab Workers' Society issued a memorandum responding to the British authorities. So the British authorities have refused a permit for a demonstration in December of 1935. About 1,000 unemployed workers in Jaffa had requested permission for a demonstration, and the government refused. And so the Arab Workers' Society issued this memorandum in which they said, if the government did not take action to solve the problem, in quote, the coming days would force the Arab Workers' Society to choose between feeding the workers bread or bullets. So basically, the Arab Workers' Society was not simply advocating for labor rights, etc., but also grounded in a militant kind of challenge to the colonial authority. There were others as well who were kind of key opponents to these British policies, including the educated middle class. These were folks, many of whom had, obtained an education in cities like Damascus, Beirut, Cairo, and upon returning to Palestine, were kind of moved to take much more militant positions than would be expected from the educated literati. And these folks also created new political parties. In the 1920s, saw the creation of the Istiqlal Party, which became a very militant advocate of not only end of colonization, but also the kind of the defeat of the Zionist project. They also wanted full self-determination for the Palestinian people, whereas some members of the sort of urban elite were fine with creating some kind of a mandate like system with with the model being Iraq, that we'll have some kind of a a semi-sovereign entity under British rule. The much more militant members of the militant proponents of the revolt were of the view that we need full liberation and full independence from British and Zionist uh, uh, rule in this period of time. So this Istiqlal party was a very major player there. You also had sections of the notables and the clerics who were, became disaffected with colonial rule and saw that there was sort of a scope for creating, pushing back and creating perhaps a new kind of reality during this time. And many of these folks were, caught between, on the one hand, should this be should this be about the liberation of Palestine, or should this be linked to a more pan-Arab cause of defeating colonialism regionally? Many of the militants who had been kind of closely tied to the struggle in Syria and in Egypt were of the opinion that this has to be a pan-Arab struggle. So they saw no contradiction between a struggle for Palestinian liberation and a pan-Arab kind of struggle against colonial rule, both British and French, during this period of time. So, as I mentioned, the Ayan, the kind of notables, found themselves sort of straddling, both sides of the fence, because socially and politically and historically, they of course were obligated to side with the revolt, but economically they were tied more to the colonial kind of apparatus, and so had to, find a bridge between these two. And sometimes they found themselves, leaning in one direction or the other. By towards the end of the revolt, they many of these figures actively kind of opposed the revolutionaries and ended up making common cause with the colonial authorities as well. So, do we have any? Is it okay if I continue for a few more minutes, or should we?
बिल्कुल 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 please.
So I want to bring the figure of Izzuddin al-Qassam right into this conversation, because here is a figure that in many ways is sort of an indelible kind of iconic figure that is forever associated with the Great Revolt. He also occupies a somewhat of a kind of an interesting position, in that he was a Muslim cleric. Right? Someone who was kind of trained in the religious tradition. He wasn't someone who was radicalized by, for example, the Istiqlal party folks. I mean, these were, many of whom were educated in secular contexts, who were kind of attracted to Marxism, Leninism, who were thinking about, international socialism, etc. Izzuddin al-Qassam came from a very different kind of background. He was a religious teacher, whose father also was a religious teacher, who came from the Salafiyat, tradition, and was also, his family was bound to the Naqshbandi Sufi tradition. So he, as a religious teacher in Syria, began to kind of, link his religious ethics and his religious motivations with the sort of secular goals of fighting colonial power. So famously, of course, fought against French rule, and also made common cause with the Libyans against Italian colonial violence during this period of time. And for his efforts was now placed under a kind of he was seen as a threat to the French authorities in Damascus, and had to flee to Palestine, made his home in Haifa, which is now a kind of a place of gathering for thousands and thousands of Palestinian rural emigres who are now coming to Haifa to seek labor, to seek work, and working in these sort of under very, very difficult conditions. Al-Qassam famously tied his preaching with the plight of working class people. And it's a very interesting kind of almost straddling both a kind of religious motivations and these sort of secular motivations. Now, Al-Qassam's legacy is very different from that of, say, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who became sort of one of the leaders of the kind of the part of the elite leadership that led the revolt formally, but then also kind of abandoned the revolt at various stages. And al-Husseini is sort of, ended up fleeing to Beirut and so on and so forth. Um, but Al-Qassam was a very working class grounded figure. In fact, he was also seen to be close to and deeply loved by the workers who were being mobilized by the Arab Workers' Society in cities like Haifa. Uh, for for Izzuddin al-Qassam, the idea of religious revivalism was inextricably linked to the class antagonism that was at play. So he condemned not only the outsiders and foreigners who were now dominating and stealing from Palestine and kind of oppressing and exploiting Palestinian labor, but also the kind of local functionaries and local beneficiaries of colonial rule. So he spoke out against the business elite and the landed elite, etc. So he had a kind of class critique as well in his religious revivalist movement. And in this, he's often compared with other figures during this period of time: Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood, Abdul Karim, who kind of a preacher who preached against Spanish rule in Morocco. So effectively linking religious revivalism with anti-colonial struggle. In other words, revivalism only makes sense if it is directed towards the liberation, the struggle for liberation against colonial rule, right? Not revivalism as a kind of quietism that seeks to make a kind of remake individuals in a spiritual sense, but to activate the political and secular goals of people through the sort of religious revivalism. He also, among the cadre that he kind of preached to, he built a military cadre, kind of military units, and these were largely working class folks. They were dispossessed peasants, casual laborers in cities like Haifa, and then effectively launched what was to become the moment in 1936, which led to the Great Revolt, right? And this revolt starts in 1935. He gets killed immediately as soon as the revolt begins. But the martyrdom of Izzuddin al-Qassam becomes a sort of pivotal moment in the Palestinian narrative. And it is no surprise that the legacy of Izzuddin al-Qassam has continued to be kind of revived in various ways. We all are familiar with the perhaps not very much so in the early 1970s. Palestinian militants launched attacks in Europe against Israelis. One of those operations was also named after Izzuddin al-Qassam. Right? Those were secular militants, right, of the PFLP, etc. And then, of course, in the 1980s on with Hamas, the kind of military wing of Hamas is called the Izzuddin al-Qassam Brigades. Right, there are various missiles that Hamas has developed, called the Qassam missiles, etc., etc. So his legacy kind of lives on and has become, and crosses. It's not only by those parties and entities that are kind of more religious in orientation, like Hamas, but also among the secular, non-religious sections of Palestinian society. Also, his legacy kind of continues to live on. So, in any case, what were some of the kinds of big demands that this revolt placed on the table? I mentioned some of these in passing, but just to sum up here, the revolt had a very deep-rooted class character, and this is something to keep in mind. This was not only national aspirations, as in we want a new country, we want our own government, etc. What was to be the nature of this new nation? What was to be the nature of this new state? And following Anderson and others, we see this as a state formation project from below. They banned land sales to the Zionists, said no land should be sold, right? And this they put on notice the various big landowners as well, saying in Palestinian society, you can't alienate our land. They forbade participation of labor in these various kinds of construction activities and various kinds of industrial activities, etc. And they made these demands alongside also paying attention to the everyday struggles of working people, of peasants, especially in the urban areas and the rural areas where peasants were deeply in debt, were unable to pay their debts, and were under threat of losing their land. So they declared a moratorium, right, of kind of militant declaration of moratorium on all debt, canceling debt, even debt owed to Palestinian landholders, right, landowners, landlords. So the members of the Ayan, sort of the elite were also put on notice that you cannot, you will not get your debt back. We're canceling all this debt. Urban debt was also cancelled. They also cancelled rent and said, working class folks in cities like Haifa don't have to pay rent anymore. Rents are exorbitant. It takes a huge chunk of their small wages away every month. So they canceled debt. They imposed new taxes on landowners and businesses and said, hey, if you want to be part of the struggle, you are to contribute based on the wealth that you have. And they would do this, what colonial authorities would call extortion, right? This was a kind of taxation regime. Very importantly, they also enacted various kinds of cultural actions. Right? If you look at the old photographs of this period, members of the elite would often don Turkish fez hats. Right, and it was a commonplace in the early 20th century. It was a kind of a symbol of respectability and so on and so forth. The revolutionaries of the 1936 revolt effectively brought a rural kind of alternative to the fez cap. And this alternative, the so-called kufiya, this kufiya became now the symbol of the Palestinian people and replaced the fez cap. You see, since then, every kind of Palestinian nationalist and political entity that has legitimacy among the population deeply reveres this symbol of the ordinary fellahin of the rural Palestine now becomes a national symbol. So this was one of the great kind of symbolic outcomes of the struggle. And they also kind of enacted this very militant boycott. And I want to bring up the question of boycott also now, because boycott today, we know about the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, an international effort to hold Israel accountable and bring them to account. But in this period of time, you can see how they link the kind of material, social dimensions of everyday life, how people are being alienated, people are being paid poor wages, they're denied jobs, denied employment security, etc. To this idea that if you own these businesses, then you are able to kind of take our wealth, right? So the boycotting of these businesses now becomes an important part, and many of the proponents of boycott were in the urban context. Many women, many kind of young men, including I think the Boy Scouts in cities like Jerusalem, were also participating in these boycotts and enforcing these boycotts. They would go to the markets and basically say, hey, you can't buy from this business, right? They're under the boycott, so on and so forth. So all in all, I mean, scholars refer to this as a kind of a broad-based revenge of the countryside. This was where the kind of proletarian logic of the Palestinian revolt needs to be kind of really taken into account. So what I will do is I'll stop here for now, and the kind of the outcomes of this here. But I just want to kind of put this out here. To close, these are the sources I've consulted in kind of laying out these remarks. Sorry. Among these, the revolution of 1936-39 in Palestine by the great legendary Ghassan Kanafani is a kind of an incredibly important work. I highly recommend, if you are ever interested in this history, to please dive into the work, as well as the numerous other fantastic works, including his novels. Kanafani is, again, like many other great figures of the 1970s, who was assassinated by Israel, is seen as one of the great figures of Palestinian struggle. Alongside this, I also consulted a book by Noor Masala, who's a historian, a Palestinian historian. This amazing work called Palestine: A 4,000-Year History, which really does a lot of work to dismantle the Zionist claims, especially around sort of this claim that one can think about Jewishness as being somehow something that is separate from the history of Palestine. That that somehow European Jews have a higher claim, etc., or thinking about Palestine outside as only being legible in terms of sort of the Western narrative of Jewish Zionist colonization and claims over the Holy Land, etc., etc. It's a fascinating work that really dives into a lot of history. And then these two works, one by Ted Swedenborg, Memories of Revolt, the 1936-39 Rebellion, the Palestinian National Past, which very, very importantly places at front, right, and center the figure of the peasant, the the Fellahin of Palestine, who were really key movers and shakers in this revolt, and whose legacy has been kind of obscured by both Zionist historians, but also by various Palestinian nationalist historians who've kind of not really paid attention to the class logic here. Sort of the quote unquote revenge of the countryside quote that I had in the last slide really stands testament to this. That it was the peasant leadership, the peasant fighters, and the kind of disaffected peasantry who found themselves in these working class situations in cities like Haifa, who became the core cadre of the militant insurgents who fought alongside Izzadin al-Qassam and others in waging this great struggle of 1936-39. And this piece by Charles Anderson, which I found very, very useful to think with, in terms of how this struggle is not really about overthrowing the yoke of colonial rule, overthrowing Zionist colonization, but also building and creating a new kind of reality, a kind of state formation project from below, and how the Great Revolt has to be seen in light of the kind of ongoing struggle of the Palestinian people to not just overthrow colonialism and Zionism, but to actually build a free and sovereign state of Palestine. So I'll stop here so we can open this up for conversation. My apologies for going much longer than I had hoped to.
No, please don't apologize. This was fantastic. What a fantastic overview. So thank you so much for that. This was highly illuminating. And can I just say, तमाम शुरुका के लिए जो हैं यहाँ पे, that Raja Swamy Bhai has been at the forefront of the Palestinian Solidarity campaign in his campus at Tennessee. And I know this not just because he makes an appearance on the Canary Mission website. Anyone who strives for Palestinian struggle gets in some ways harassed. And Raja Swamy Bhai, it's one of those figures who have literally put so much at stake for the Palestinian cause, for the Palestinian campaign in his university. But I also know this because we share a mutual friend, which I just realized, Arsalan Khan. And Arsalan, Raja Bhai has spoken, so highly of you, and I really hope that we get to meet one day. So it really is an honor to have you first and foremost, and to listen to this excellent talk. I just have maybe one or two things to say, and then maybe we can open it up to the audience. And I just wanted to remark upon on the central one of the central themes in your talk, which is this emphasis on class struggle. Which I think, in some ways we tend to forget that the Palestinian struggle has so many kind of expressions, and this history in some ways reminds us of those many different expressions, and what the Palestinian struggle in its historical kind of development also began as. So I really appreciate that, and maybe I was wondering if you could maybe remark upon the present as well, and how you see the continuity between what you spoke about, especially in relation to imperial patronage of Zionist settler colonialism in the 1930s and indeed in the present. So I think that will help us kind of transition to the questions, a transition to other people if they have questions. So thank you again for this excellent talk.
Thank you, Dr. Raza. Thank you so much. So in terms of the present, I mean, there's kind of remarkable, perhaps not similarities, but echoes of this, right? So take, for example, the Palestinian Authority, right? This sort of administrative body that has been set up under the aegis of the Oslo talks, that was supposed to become the kind of the core of a possible Palestinian state. That the dream of that state has kind of withered away on that count. But what we're seeing, both in the first Intifada of 1987, which led to the so-called Palestinian Authority being formed as a kind of as a stopgap measure by the Israeli and American kind of imperialists, as well as in the second Intifada, right? What we're seeing is that the Palestinian Authority now becomes not only a kind of an ambivalent player between the popular masses who are pushing for more radical futures and the colonial imperialist Zionist entity, but they see themselves also increasingly siding with the imperialist Zionist entity as
Right.
enforcers of the
Yeah, yeah,
project, right?
yeah.
So, and I mean, this is very starkly embodied in the figure of somebody like Mahmoud Abbas, right?
Mm,
Who goes around internationally, paraded as the president of Palestine. But what is that presidency is substantively about? So, in that sense, I think the class politics that are at play here, perhaps not strictly a class politics, but a kind of a politics of patronage, right? The imperial
right.
colonial power now,
Understood.
is the patron, and the clients here are the kind of the middlemen, right? And what's happened is that if you look at the history of the both the intifadas, the 1987 intifada and the Al-Aqsa intifada of 2000, the emergence of these moments is really fascinating. Which is why it's so important to compare this with 1936, because you have these periods of time where there's a quote unquote peace, but this peace is a very horrid peace, right? But people are being
Mm,
dispossessed, people are being exploited, and there's a small section of the society that is benefiting, and
mm,
then it explodes. The
mm,
87 intifada, if I recall correctly, started in Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza.
mm.
A group of workers were being, going in a bus, in a minivan, I think, to, headed towards Israel because they would be allowed to work in Israel. And I think an armored car hit that vehicle, and these workers were killed. And so immediately, people around there started kind of throwing stones on the Israeli military, and that exploded very quickly, right? So it starts with a kind of working class disaffection, but it's not just that event. That event is sort of the spark, but there's already a simmering hatred of what is being done to the people. And then what happens later, by 1990 with the Oslo Accords, Arafat is sort of brought in as sort of, hey, come, you have to
Got it.
manage what? Not the Zionist project, but you have to manage your people against the Zionist project,
Absolutely.
right? So how are you going to do this? And same thing happens after the Al-Aqsa Intifada too. You see now the spectacle of Mahmoud Abbas and his goons going after fighters and their families in the West Bank, not and not doing a thing to support the struggle in
And with
Gaza.
the
Right?
yeah,
So I think that
and
class logic takes on a new form,
yeah,
but it has the same dynamic.
no, that's great, and especially with the Palestinian police effectively acting as enforcers of Israeli occupation. Rather than yeah, and effectively, as you're right, acting as collaborators with the Israeli occupation. So, thank you for this. If there are any questions, जो अगर बाकी शुरू का सवाल पूछना चाहें, तो मैं उनको दावत दूंगा कि वो अपना माइक जो है वो अनम्यूट करके सवाल पूछ लें.
John?
इजाज साहब.
G. I'm sorry, my phone was not working. So I just joined. Thank you very much. Is it still continuing or what?
Sorry?
Are you still continuing?
जी हम अभी सवाल ले रहे हैं.
अच्छा ठीक है. मैं करूँ एक दो सवाल या कमेंट.
If you could keep it to one question, please.
Okay. उर्दू में बोलूं अंग्रेजी में?
आप अगर
whatever. Okay, I just listened to this young man now very little. I'm sorry my phone was not working for whole of the day, but suddenly it worked now. And we know what has been happening and what is happening really in Palestine by the Israel and America and these world powers. This time, probably America has been, not supported by many European countries and all that. But even then, there have been a lot of sufferings in Palestine, and we as Pakistanis are supporting and, what is really happening. Now, the question is that how the Palestinian be helped out and what is the process, what will be the process for reconstruction of this country and the poverty that they're facing and the destruction of their homes and buildings and roads and water and gas pipelines, whatever. So one has to really think. And as Muslims also, but as human beings, I think we are human beings and we have to condemn these actions of other side of human beings, that is Israel and USA also at the same time. And this what I have to say. We are an NGO or a social organization. We can only speak and support, and maybe we are able to raise some funds to send them, and things can be done. So we will see in our meeting of Irtiqa, who's I'm the chairman, and we should see how can we help Palestinians and what could be done. We have to express sympathies, and even now, what is happening in between USA and Iran and the Israel is in between. Things are in a very worse shape that one has to take. In Pakistan, we are trying our best as a whole to look into the different matters of the destruction of the people, of the humanity as a whole, and Muslims as a whole, are especially the Muslims and the humanity, because we don't have to forget humanity. It is the Allah and God who has created the entire world and universe and the people and human beings that one has to. So I just express my sympathies with Palestinian, and I'm thankful to the speaker that they have really given us enlightenment and new things we have learned. Although I listened very little, and I'm thankful to our
Thank you,
friend
sir. Thank you.
Kaleem Durrani and others that they have. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Raja bhai, if I can just maybe add something to it. So
Please do.
I think Ijaz Saab in some ways is asking a question that's been at the forefront of our minds, which is what can we do, being so removed from obviously Palestine itself, but we carry Palestine in our hearts. And I know that you have been, as I was mentioning, at the forefront of the struggle as well, where you are. So if you could please, offer some advice to us all. Thank you.
So you is that to me?
Yes. So if you could
Oh, okay.
if you could
Okay.
reflect on what we can
Yeah.
do
What can we do?
as basically, yes, those in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. Thank you.
Uh, okay. So I'll kind of I'll offer two related aspects. Right? One is what can we do directly. One is I think we can each in our own way respect the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, and kind of work with their their recommendations. Uh, Boycott seems to be, on the face of it, we think, oh, if it's just one person eating one meal somewhere, how is that going to affect anything? These things work in aggregate. Once you have hundreds of thousands, tens of millions starting to boycott, then these corporate entities also are put on the spot. Other things that can be done, I think very importantly, the narrative, the narratives that are being promoted, both in the mainstream media as well as in official narratives, should be seriously, if not challenged directly, problematized. So, for example, if when Mahmoud Abbas is paraded as president of Palestine, I think we should remind our friends and colleagues that, hey, what is happening here is much more complex, and bringing a little complexity into the conversation is very important, because part of the ways in which like these processes get obscured is because we don't question the ways in which they're constructed, right? Who decided that, or if that, if one sees this Palestinian struggle simply as a religious matter, right, as opposed to an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist project, right?
That's right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And very importantly in this moment, because one of the key kind of instruments that the other side has is that they can shut us up by claiming that we are anti-Semitic, right?
Mm.
And I think in this it's very important that we distinguish ourselves. Our critique must be grounded in the highest principles of
Absolutely.
humanity, of
Of
inclusiveness,
internationalism.
universal
Of
rights. So we should never fall prey. And now there are various American right-wing figures, people like
yes.
Tucker Carlson, who have jumped on the bandwagon now. We
Yes.
have to be careful. These WhatsApp shares and these posts, etc. A lot of people get caught into this stuff, right? And then they end up repeating. I have Facebook friends who kind of fall into this, right? They end up repeating the kinds of anti-Semitic tropes, etc. We have to be careful to distinguish our struggle. And I didn't mention this, but among the smaller groups that actually also contributed, and in fact, some of its members also were killed in the revolt, were Jewish members of the Palestine Communist Party, right? And so there are Jewish comrades who have been
Mm.
fighting alongside and taking great risks. I mean, to this day,
Absolutely.
figures like Norman Finkelstein or Ian Pape, historians who have really are also part of the struggle. So we have to remember that. That's very important. Um, and one thing that I think, especially for those of we are all from South Asia, so as Pakistanis, as Indians, as Sri Lankans, etc., linking the Palestinian struggle to the anti-colonial struggle, I think allows us to see how the failures of the post-colonial state in India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., is linked to the failures of the struggle in Palestine. Right?
Yeah.
So you have the Mahmoud Abbases over there, but we also have the Modis and these other clowns in South Asia
Yeah.
who are also doing
Yes.
the work of the imperialists in various
That's
ways,
right.
who are
That's
benefiting
right.
big capital, who are destroying, the kind of agrarian peoples and lives, right? And in these
Yeah.
processes. So I think seeing the connections is very important for us in this moment.
Yeah. No, I could not agree more. And there's a question in the comment box as well, which is around Pakistan's mediatory role. And I'll just quickly take that if I may. I mean, I don't think Pakistan has much of a mediatory role to play in the Palestinian conflict specifically. They are playing some kind of a mediation role between US and Iran. But how that plays out is of anybody's, is anybody's guess. But I'll just like reiterate and reemphasize what Dr. Raja Swamy just said, which is that Palestine is an internationalist struggle. It's an international struggle, broader solidarities, those kind of broader connections. They help kind of place this struggle in in light of what it actually is, which is not a religious conflict, which is instead a conflict of anti-colonial struggle against against the last one of the last vestiges of settler colonial rule. I could not agree more. There was another question, Dr. Rajaswamy, if you can briefly answer that, because I think, and then we'll close off. Um, there was a role. There was a role. Sorry, there was a question earlier on the role of Hamas now. And if I can just like add maybe another question to that question, which is where do you see the Palestinian struggle going now? Like, what does the struggle look like after Gaza and the devastation that we have witnessed in Gaza? So, if you could reflect on that, please.
That's a very big question. So I'll offer uh, 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 with necessary humility. I'm not someone who can kind of speak to the future of the struggle, etc., in any kind of way beyond my own standpoint as an outsider, sympathetic and in solidarity outsider.
Yes.
So on Hamas's role. Well, Hamas emerged in the 1980s, largely, as a result, and you see this throughout the historical period, right? Even the 1930s, the failures of the existing arrangement, right, open up spaces for the creation of new alternatives, and Hamas emerged as, primarily a religion-driven kind of social services organization that was, providing various forms of care for the poorest, most kind of marginalized sections of society in Palestine, right? Largely, much of its work was in Gaza, but also very active in the West Bank as well. But Hamas, during that time, during the first Intifada, became a big player because it was able to kind of tap into, and many of the kind of disaffected people, were drawn to Hamas because it stood for a kind of polity that was grounded here and now. Remember, the PLO had been exiled. The PLO first founded, was formed, and then, was exiled from Jordan to Beirut, and then from Beirut in 1982 was relocated to Tunis, and then, in the early 90s it was sort of rehabilitated back into Palestine under the aegis of the Palestinian Authority and the emergence of Palestinian Authority. But Hamas grounded itself as a kind of organization that has always been, with the people, right? So it had developed its legitimacy in that way. Now, in the earlier phase, Hamas kind of was much more religiously grounded, but Norman Finkelstein and others have pointed out that as you see Hamas's growth, by the second Intifada and after, as being a kind of not just a, social service organization, but also one organization that is, embracing the idea of armed struggle, right, in a way that the other organizations that had done so couldn't fully succeed, right? Even PFLP, etc., were much more in the diaspora. But Hamas internally was able to kind of mobilize the angst of the Palestinian people and kind of direct this towards both a direct confrontation with the Israeli state, but also building its apparatuses within, right, running schools, clinics, so on and so forth. Um, Today, it would be fair to say that Izzadin al-Qassam, as John Elmer, who works with the Electronic Intifada, has repeatedly mentioned this, we should see Hamas's Izzadin al-Qassam as the core brigade of the Palestinian National Armed Forces, right? Fatah, which used to claim that role, is now a junior partner. Fatah fighters who
Yeah, yeah.
joined in the struggle. Mind you, the Gaza rebellion in 2023 involved, of course, Al-Qassam, but also Sarai al-Quds, which is affiliated with Islamic Jihad, but also PFLP, Abu Ali Mustafa brigades of PFLP, and other brigades associated with the DFLP, Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine. So you had leftist, Marxist-Leninist groups, Islamist groups, etc., all come together on these grounds, right? And so in that sense, in terms of armed struggle and its future, one of the reasons given for why the 1936 revolt failed, that I think bears keeping in mind, is that ultimately it wasn't the failure of the Palestinian people to effectively overthrow, Zionism or colonialism, but it was the sheer disparity of military power,
Right.
right? Small rifles, etc. And no matter how much ingenuity went into the struggle, they disrupted rail lines, and I mean, it did amazing kinds of things. There are fascinating stories of that period, right? Despite that, or in the 2023 attack, right? Using like paragliding, paragliders, and doing all this stuff. The ingenuity notwithstanding, the balance of power militarily is very massive. But that said, that balance of power is also shifting. It is not static. And eventually, the Palestinian people, like the Lebanese people, with the leadership of Hezbollah right now, are going to, the connection between the sort of armed struggle and the national aspiration is solid. It will never go away. And the Zionists are living a fool's paradise if they think that simply, massacring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands is somehow going to, erase the Palestinian struggle. It will never do that. In fact, one of the anecdotal, one of the anecdotes one heard in the aftermath of the 2023 attacks was that about 80% of the fighters in Qassam brigades were orphans or extremely poor kids who found a home within the ranks of Hamas.
Yep.
right? So just as Izzuddin al-Qassam was working with the poorest, the most marginalized in Haifa in 1935, you're seeing Hamas also playing this role, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there are many criticisms of Hamas and legitimate ones, and that's for the Palestinian people to decide how they kind of position their relationship with Hamas in the long run. But as of now, it clearly Izzadin al-Qassam is the kind of military organization of the nascent Palestinian armed forces. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I thank you. This was amazing. We have a few more questions, but I think I can quickly address them. I mean, one question, well, two questions really. We can just group them together. Why is the Pakistani government not showing support for the Palestinian struggle? And the same question is asked for the OIC. कि OIC और पाकिस्तान क्यों ज़्यादा ये भरपूर तरीके से इनकी हिमायत नहीं कर रहे मेरे ख्याल से आप दोस्तों को इसका जवाब मुझसे बेहतर पता है I think we all know why that is the case and because I mean we are in many ways beholden to the American empire and that remains the case sadly and international humanitarian law I think maybe we can end on this. I think a lot has been made on the on international humanitarian law, and I think that uh, uh, as many commentators have remarked, that Gaza specifically marks in some ways the not just the rapid erosion, but perhaps the death of international humanitarian law. That in many ways, those who claim to uphold it have really been unmasked in all their hypocrisy. And the so-called rules-based international order effectively lies in tatters. I don't know, Raja Bhai, if you would like to add to that, and maybe yeah, this can be the final word from your end, and then we can bring this to a close.
I fully agree, Ali Bhai, that international law is in tatters, and the legitimacy of the post Second World War kind of
Absolutely.
setup with international law, the multilateral institutions, is in tatters. To kind
Absolutely.
of to telescope outwards, I think we are witnessing the collapse of the U.S. empire. And in this moment, we're seeing all kinds of transformations taking place, and the sort of lurch towards this sort of hideous form of mass violence, genocide, normalizing genocide, is one aspect of this shift. I'm reminded of the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, made this very important, insightful remark, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said, "What we're seeing in Gaza is what is in store for the millions of people who are going to be fleeing from the climate crisis."
Yep.
Essentially, we should not put our hopes on the West to save the world from genocide. In fact, they are the primary proponents of genocide, and they will do
That's right.
everything possible to, you know, we
That's
call
right.
them out for hypocrisy. But I think we should start building the alternatives. We
Yep.
should start building, and I'm really hopeful that the civil society endeavors that are taking place, right, holding truth commissions, right, bringing international solidarity movements together, right, to think about, because we have a horrible future ahead of us, but we can overcome that if we build international solidarity and we develop a real revolutionary program going forward, and
Yep.
not relying on is the UN going to do something, is
That's right.
Mohammed bin Salman going to do something. None of these folks are going to do anything. They will
Yep.
pursue their interests. We have to focus on the grounded interests that tie us together. Palestinian working people, ordinary folks, the civil society folks are we must embrace them as part of the global international working class, and as such we must also link our struggles with their struggles, is what I'm hoping for. It sounds very idealistic, but this is a time to think,
Absolutely.
new workable utopias we have to think.
Absolutely. It's the time to think, it's the time to dream. 100%. बिल्कुल. Absolutely. Thank you so much. कामरान साहब अगर आप इख्तितामी कलमात कुछ कहना चाहें.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swamy Saab, for giving us such a deep insight regarding the Palestine and their people, their sufferings, and also putting the historical fact in front of us. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dr. Saab, Ali Raza Saab, for conducting such a wonderful program. In last, I just want to thank you. In last, I just want to invite Mr. Ejaz, who is also president of Irtiqa Institute of Social Sciences, to come and just wrap up the program. Thank you very much, all the participants too. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar sir.
Thank you, sir. I just want to wrap up this program by saying once again, thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Dr. Saab. Thank you. And thank you all the participants that all of you came on time and give us your time for such a and listening all this all. Thank you very much, sir, both the doctors. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raja.
Okay, just
Yeah. I have joined her. Okay, on behalf of Irtiqa Institute of Social Sciences, I'm grateful to Raja Swamy and Dr. Ali Raza to join that session and give an insight to the history of Palestine issue and the background, and also uh, uh, about the Palestinian issue. Thank you very much.